I want to say a very warm welcome to the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Professor Juan Mendez in Washington, and to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, Magdalena Sepulveda Carmona, who is in Geneva. And a big hello to all those who are watching us today, wherever you are, all over the world. I am Kolbasia, one of the founding member of and the coordinator of the Survivor Speak Out Network. We are survivor-led activist group, and we are supported and facilitated by Freedom from Torture. Our aim is to raise awareness of the challenges that faced by survivors of torture living in the UK, and also campaign against the use of torture. And I am very happy to introduce this event on their behalf. Today, to mark both the UN International Day for the Eradication of Poverty and Freedom from Torture, New Poverty Barrier Research, we are holding a very special one-off question and answer session with those two global human rights heavyweight. I'm pleased to say that we received a lot of questions over the last few weeks that people want to ask you guys, and we managed to get them down to only three. The first question come from Jenny, who lives in Manchester. She asked the question: how do you see relationship between torture and poverty? I guess Professor Mendes, perhaps you would like to go first for this one.
Well, thank you. And first, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this exciting panel. I wish I could be there personally in London, but I do appreciate your effort to invite me. I would say that in my experience as a special rapporteur on torture, the relationships between poverty and torture are manifold and at different levels. The first one, for example, is that um, people in poor countries tend to be more vulnerable to torture than in other countries. But I want to stress that that's not automatic. There are some poor countries that do an admirable job of protecting their people from torture and even from cruel, inhuman, and degrading conditions. We have seen very poor countries that have very decent prisons, for example. But it's undeniable that the obligations of the state to prevent and to punish torture require an independent judiciary that is also well financed, require investment in national preventive mechanisms, and of course the level of support that poor countries are able to provide for their own state institutions is much more limited because of the uneven distribution of wealth among nations. That I think is the first level. But the second level is that even within rich countries, poor people are much more vulnerable to mistreatment because they don't have the wherewithal to defend themselves from mistreatment by the police, for example, or by the security forces, because they don't have access to lawyers easily. And because in the cases where the state is particularly interested in mistreating defendants, there are all kinds of ways in which exceptions to the rules on treatment of offenders can be circumvented. Uh, and then I think, lastly, the relationship that I see in my experience is that individual poor people have a very difficult time even knowing their rights, knowing that they can remain silent before when they're being interrogated, knowing that they can demand to see a lawyer before seeing an interrogator, uh, knowing that they have a right that whatever they said under pressure should be excluded from their testimony at trial. So, for a variety of reasons, I think the eradication of torture is very closely linked to the eradication of poverty in our world today.
Yes, indeed. I agree with Juan that the relationship is in different levels. And I agree with all the links that he made. I just want to emphasize that living in poverty is not only about lack of income, it is really a lack of human capabilities and a lack of power. And when someone is powerless, the people really have limited access to justice. They have limited access to security, and of course, this increases their exposure to all type of violence, including the exposure to torture. And then, on the other hand, when people living in poverty are victim of torture, their economic and social situation is aggravated. And as a consequence of that, their poverty is often perpetuated.
Okay, thank you. I'm working with survivors of torture across the UK. One thing that SSO have learned is that the recovery is very difficult if therapy isn't complemented by other essential services, including healthcare, social services, and education. And on behalf of survivors uh, in the UK and also around the world, we would like to ask what advice you have for state about how to ensure that the rehabilitation services are holistic even in difficult financial times? And do you think a survivor entitlement to these services should be different depending on whether he or she is an asylum applicant, even a refused asylum applicant? I pass that question to you, Ms. Sepulveda.
Thank you. I think that we have to be very careful in regards to state not to use the
To
issue of austerity or the financial crisis as an excuse, really, to cut all type of support and protection for victims of torture. And even though if the financial environment is not the most appropriate, my advice to state is really to look at it in a comprehensive manner and to take common sense measures. And let me briefly explain this. One is that oftentimes asylum seekers and refugees who have been victims of torture do not have the right to work. And this is really lack of common sense, because without access to work for an extended period of time that sometimes take more than, years in order to have a solution of the case, people are severely impacted, and it's very difficult then to go back to work after you have passed many years without working. And it also impacts heavily on your social inclusion. So why to deny asylum seekers and refugees of their possibility not only to gain their living, but also to contribute to the society where they are in? And the same happens with the right to education and the right to health. If they are not provided with access to education and access to healthcare services, it's going to be impossible for them to integrate in the society and to contribute in the society in the country where they are, or if they are able to return to their country of origin. So comprehensive measures from that side will imply not only that they need to receive some support, that is of course very important, but also that they are supported by enabling them to integrate in the society by working, by having access to education, and also access to healthcare services.
Thank you. Professor Mendes, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, well, first to agree completely with Ms. Sepulveda on that matter, but I would also say that from the perspective of the rules applying to the obligation to provide rehabilitation services, that's a very clear standard in the Convention Against Torture. And I don't think it should be conditioned on whether somebody is an asylum applicant or a refugee, because there are a variety of reasons why you may not be entitled to asylum or refugee status, and you still may be a victim of torture. Now, the remedies that are mandated by the Convention Against Torture first generally apply to the territorial state, the state where the torture actually happened. But I think it's important to note that at least the rehabilitation services also apply to third country states where the person happens to be living at the time when he or she needs the rehabilitation services. And I would say that they should not be conditioned on immigration status. They should be given on the basis of whether the person needs the services or not. I would also add that it's important for those services to be planned and programmed and even executed with the active participation of the beneficiaries. That's a way from breaking out of the cycle of poverty by being empowered to participate in what in what you need the most. But I also think it makes sense from the perspective of careful management of resources. And it is true that there's some investment that's needed, but I think there's quite a bit of experience that shows that rehabilitation services need not be an important drain on the treasury of any country, including any receiving country. Uh, there are plenty of opportunities for participation by the victims themselves, but also by well-established NGOs that provide admirable services around the world on the matter of rehabilitation.
Thank you. Just taking from your answer, Professor Mendes, I will go nicely to the our last question, um, who come from none other than John Snow at Channel 4 News. He asked, are states sufficiently aware of the obligation that flow from the right to rehabilitation in the UN Torture Convention? And if not, what should be done about this? So over to you, Professor Mendes.
Well, again, the main debate on the Torture Convention is whether the obligations to provide remedies, including rehabilitation, are directed only to the country that actually practiced the torture. I don't believe that that's a proper reading of the convention. Certainly, it depends on the remedy. But for example, the remedy of prosecuting and punishing the perpetrators of torture obviously is directed to the state that whose agents committed the torture. The receiving state of someone who has crossed borders does not have the obligation to prosecute and not even the ability to prosecute torturers who are not agents of the receiving state. But there are other obligations that do apply to a third party state, like in this case, for example, the obligation not to return someone to a place where he or she could be tortured. And I think the obligation to provide rehabilitation services is one that stands more or less in the middle. Reasonable rehabilitation services should be the obligation of any state, including states where the torture victim is residing. And again, not depending on whether that person has a proper immigration status or not. And finally, I would say that the Freedom from Torture report issued last July makes a very compelling case for why this is not only legally important and true, but also makes sense from a perspective of reduction of poverty and of proper relations in highly integrated communities like the United Kingdom and other receiving states. I think the fact that torture makes a poor person even poorer, compels us to make sure that we don't let that effect of torture be complicated by the fact that there are no rehabilitation services, that there are no opportunities to break out of the cycle of poverty and break out of the cycle of the effects of torture.
Thank you. Ms. Sybil, would you like to add something?
Yes, and if you ask me what should be done in order
Yeah.
to promote the obligation of the states, I think that it's very important for the general public to understand that it's really related to the type of society in which we want to live. I certainly would like to live in a society that welcome people that have been victim of torture, that protect them and support them. And I think that it is everybody's responsibility to ensure that our states, our government comply with their obligations that really will make us to live in better societies.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm afraid that that's all we have time for it today. But thank you both very, very much for taking the time out to answer this question. It was a great discussion, and we really appreciate you sharing your thought. And good luck with your respecting mandate, and we will be always there supporting you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Right. And thank you to everybody that submitted their questions and for tuning in. Please take the time to read Freedom from Torture, Poverty Barrier Research. You can see it at freedomfromtorture.org/poverty barrier. Goodbye from all of us here.